Just this past year, Iran has attacked Kurds in Iraq, slaughtered Sunnis in Syria, armed Hezbollah in Lebanon, financed Hamas in Gaza, fired missiles into Saudi Arabia, and threatened freedom of navigation in the Straits of Hormuz and the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Some peace, some moderation. Now, if you think that Iran's aggression has been confined to the Middle East, think again. Last month, 2 Iranian agents were arrested for plotting terror attacks right here in the United States. And several weeks ago, Iranian agents were arrested for plotting terror attacks in the heart of Europe. Yet, while the United States is confronting Iran with new sanctions, Europe and others are appeasing Iran by trying to help it bypass those new sanctions. Now, I've just used a word, a tough word, a very strong word, appeasement. And I use it reluctantly. But unfortunately, that's exactly what we're seeing again in Europe. Think about this. The same week, Iran was caught red-handed trying to murder European citizens. European leaders were rolling out the red carpet for President Rouhani, promising to give Iran even more money. I'm a historian's son. I have to ask. I ask it not merely as a historian's son, I ask it as a Jew, as a citizen of the world, as someone who's lived through the 20th century. Have these European leaders learned nothing from history? Will they ever wake up? Well, we in Israel, we don't need a wake-up call because Iran threatens us every day. Because despite the best of hopes, and there were many hopes around the nuclear deal, this deal did not push war further away. It brought war ever closer to our borders. In Syria, Iran is trying to establish permanent military bases against us and has already launched missiles and drones into our territory. In Gaza, Iran is arming terror groups to launch rocket attacks into our cities and terror attacks against our civilians. In Lebanon, Iran is directing Hezbollah to build secret sites to convert inaccurate projectiles into precision-guided missiles, missiles that can target deep inside Israel within an accuracy of 10 meters. Hezbollah, listen to this, Hezbollah is deliberately using the innocent people of Beirut as human shields. They've placed 3 of these missile conversion sites along Beirut's international airport. Here's a picture that's worth 1,000 missiles. Here's Beirut's international airport. Here's the first missile site. It's in the Uzai neighborhood, on the water's edge, a few blocks away from the runway. Here's the second site. It's underneath a soccer stadium. That's the soccer stadium. 2 blocks away. And here's the third site. It's adjacent to the airport itself, right next to it. So I have a message for Hezbollah today. Israel knows, Israel also knows what you're doing. Israel knows where you're doing it. And Israel will not let you get away with it. Ladies and gentlemen, just as the nuclear deal supporters were wrong about what would happen when sanctions would be removed, they were wrong, dead wrong, about what would happen when sanctions would be restored. They argued that U.S. sanctions alone would have little impact, little economic impact on Iran. That's what they said. Really? Well, let's see what happened to Iran's economy now that President Trump has forced companies to choose between doing business with Iran and doing business with the United States, whose GDP is 50 times the size of Iran's GDP. A year ago, Iran's economy was booming. Now, it's collapsing. Iran's currency is plummeting. Inflation and unemployment are soaring. British Airlines, German banks, French oil companies, Japanese oil importers, and many others are scrambling to get out. If that's little economic impact, imagine what will happen with the next batch of U.S. sanctions imposed in November. The deal's supporters were also wrong when they argued, you have to believe that they argued this. I mean, I had many arguments. They also argued that removing sanctions, that restoring sanctions, would rally the Iranian people around the regime. Well, they're definitely rallying, but not around the regime. They're rallying against the regime. They're not chanting death to America. They're chanting death to the dictator. They're not chanting export the Islamic Revolution. They're chanting leave Syria, leave Lebanon, leave Gaza, take care of us in Iran. I listened to these protests. I talked to the Iranian people. I issue these videos. And I get so many responses from Iranians. At first I thought these were Iranian exiles in the safety of London or Paris or Los Angeles. No. Iranians from Iran embracing Israel, criticizing the regime. That's an understatement. With their names. And I asked my intelligence people, what's going on? And shortly after, the protests broke out, not because of what I said, but it was an indicator of something extraordinary that was taking place there. Because in these protests, the Iranian people are showing unbelievable courage. From the urban centers to the outlying villages. And it's embracing now the whole of Iran. From the striking bazaar merchants to the young women uncovering their hair. The people of Iran are bravely standing up to a regime that has brutally repressed them for 4 decades. And that has squandered their money, still squanders their money, in bloody wars across the Middle East. So here's what I say to Europe's leaders and to others. Instead of coddling Iran's dictators, join the US and Israel and most of the Arab world in supporting new sanctions against a regime that endangers all of us and all of the world. Israel is deeply grateful to President Trump for his bold decision to withdraw from the disastrous nuclear deal with Iran. Many of our Arab neighbors are also grateful. And everyone who cares about the peace and security of the world should also be grateful. But, ladies and gentlemen, I have an important confession to make. This may surprise you, but I have to admit that the Iran deal has had one positive consequence. An unintended one, but a positive consequence. By empowering Iran, it brought Israel and many Arab states closer together than ever before. Closer together than ever before in an intimacy and friendship that I've not seen in my lifetime and would have been unimaginable a few years ago.